The pilot stood outside the CEO's office, his face drained of color, hands trembling as he clutched the termination envelope. Just 2 hours earlier, he had confidently refused to let a black woman in worn clothing board his business-class flight, certain she didn't belong there. He had no idea that one phone call from her would cost him everything. The woman he dismissed as unworthy was the one person who could destroy his career with a single conversation. And she just did. Before we dive into this incredible story of justice and consequences, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. If you believe actions have consequences, smash that like button right now. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because stories like this need to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Loretta Washington sat in the back of the rideshare vehicle, watching the Dallas skyline fade into the distance as dawn broke across Texas. At 52 years old, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that came from decades of proving herself in rooms that didn't expect her to be there. Her faded blue jeans had been washed so many times the denim felt soft as cotton. The navy sweater she wore had a small pull near the hem, and her white sneakers showed the scuff marks of countless miles walked through NASA facilities, laboratories, and testing grounds. To anyone glancing at her, she looked like someone heading to visit family, perhaps a grandmother traveling to see grandchildren. Nothing about her appearance suggested what she truly was. The worn leather satchel resting on her lap told a different story, if anyone bothered to look closely. The NASA logo, once bright and bold, had faded to a ghostly outline from years of use. Inside that bag were certificates of achievement from 3 presidents, commendation letters from astronauts whose lives depended on systems she designed, and a Presidential Medal of Science that she kept wrapped in soft cloth. Loretta had spent 28 years as one of NASA's chief aerospace engineers, pioneering navigation systems that guided spacecraft through the darkness of space. She had been the only black woman in most of those rooms, the only female voice in countless meetings, and she had earned her place through brilliance that couldn't be denied. 3 weeks ago, she had finally retired, closing a chapter of her life that had been filled with both extraordinary achievements and exhausting battles against assumptions about who she was supposed to be. This morning's flight to San Francisco held special significance. The International Society of Aerospace Engineers had selected her for their Lifetime Achievement Award, a recognition that would place her name alongside legends of aviation and space exploration. The ceremony would gather over 500 engineers, pilots, and industry leaders from around the world. But Loretta had kept the honor quiet, declining the society's offer to arrange first-class travel and accommodation. She had always believed that true dignity came not from external displays but from the quality of one's work and character. So she had booked her own business-class ticket, paid for with her own money, wanting simply to arrive rested and ready for the event without any fuss or special treatment. Meanwhile, at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, Captain Derek Hartley was finishing his pre-flight inspection with the confidence of someone who believed the world operated exactly as he expected. At 38, Derek had spent 12 years flying commercial aircraft, building a career he considered impeccable. His pressed uniform fit perfectly across his shoulders, his captain's wings gleamed on his chest, and his dark hair was styled with just enough product to look professional without appearing vain. He had been named Pilot of the Month just 3 weeks earlier, an honor that fed his already substantial ego. Derek saw himself as the guardian of standards, someone who maintained order and propriety in an increasingly chaotic world. He took pride in running what he called a tight ship, making decisions he believed protected the integrity of his aircraft and the comfort of his passengers. But underneath that polished exterior lived assumptions Derek had never questioned. He had grown up in a wealthy suburb where success and whiteness seemed synonymous, where the only black people he encountered were service workers or athletes on television. His worldview had calcified over decades, forming a lens through which he judged everyone he met. When Derek looked at passengers, he made instant assessments based on appearance, skin color, and clothing. In his mind, business class belonged to people who looked a certain way, spoke a certain way, and carried themselves with the markers of wealth and status he recognized. Anyone who didn't fit that narrow definition triggered his suspicion, and he felt not only justified but duty-bound to question their presence. Loretta arrived at Gate 17 at 6:15 in the morning, joining the line designated for business-class passengers. The early morning flight attracted mostly business travelers, and she found herself surrounded by men in suits carrying leather briefcases and women in tailored blazers tapping on tablets. Her simple clothing made her stand out like a wildflower in a field of ornamental shrubs. She noticed the glances, the way eyes flickered over her and away, the subtle shift in posture as people unconsciously distanced themselves. Loretta had experienced these microaggressions for so long they barely registered anymore. She simply pulled her boarding pass from her bag, kept her eyes forward, and waited for her turn to board. Captain Derek Hartley stood near the gate entrance, ostensibly checking paperwork but actually scanning the boarding passengers with the self-appointed authority of someone who believed he could spot problems before they started. When his eyes landed on Loretta, everything about her appearance triggered his assumptions. The worn sweater, the faded jeans, the scuffed sneakers, her brown skin, all combined into a picture that didn't match his mental image of who belonged in business class. He watched as she presented her boarding pass to the gate agent, and something in him decided this required his intervention. Derek straightened his shoulders, adjusted his captain's hat, and walked directly into Loretta's path as she attempted to proceed down the jetway. His voice carried the artificial courtesy of someone performing concern rather than feeling it. "Excuse me, ma'am. Business class is for premium passengers only. Economy boarding is at gate 12. He gestured vaguely toward the far end of the terminal, his expression suggesting he was doing her a favor by correcting what he assumed was her obvious mistake. Loretta stopped, surprised by the interruption, and looked up at the tall pilot blocking her way. She had dealt with versions of this man her entire career, people who saw her skin before her credentials, who heard her voice and made assumptions about her intelligence and capabilities. Taking a slow breath to maintain her composure, she responded with polite firmness. "I have a business class ticket, sir." She reached into her bag and extracted her boarding pass, holding it up so he could clearly see the seat assignment printed in bold letters. Derek barely glanced at the boarding pass before doubt clouded his features. "Are you sure this is your ticket? Maybe someone gave you the wrong one." His tone suggested he was offering her an out, a way to admit her mistake without embarrassment, but his words carried an unmistakable condescension that made Loretta's jaw tighten. She had spent nearly 3 decades designing systems that kept astronauts alive in the vacuum of space, calculating trajectories that required precision down to fractions of a second, solving problems that stumped rooms full of brilliant minds. And now this man was questioning whether she could understand her own boarding pass. "I purchased this ticket myself 3 weeks ago," she said, her voice remaining level despite the frustration building in her chest. "Here is my identification and confirmation number." She produced her driver's license and pulled up the email confirmation on her phone, offering both to Derek with a steady hand. Derek took the documents, but instead of accepting the clear evidence before him, his suspicion only deepened. "This doesn't seem right. How did you afford a business class ticket?" The question hung in the air like smoke, its implications unmistakable. Around them, other passengers had begun to notice the confrontation, some slowing their pace to watch, others averting their eyes in second-hand embarrassment. Loretta felt the heat of humiliation creeping up her neck, but she refused to let it show on her face. "Excuse me? What kind of question is that?" Her voice had taken on an edge now, the professional courtesy giving way to justified anger. Derek seemed oblivious to how his words landed, wrapped up in his own certainty that he was performing his duties correctly. "I'm just doing my job," he continued, his voice rising slightly as if volume would legitimize his actions. "We've had issues with fraudulent tickets lately. I need to verify this with the gate agent." He turned and called over Brittany, the gate agent who had already scanned Loretta's boarding pass and found no issues. The young woman approached with visible reluctance, sensing the tension before she even heard the question. "We need to check if this ticket is legitimate," Derek announced loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. Something doesn't add up here. Loretta stood frozen in place as Derek effectively put her on trial in front of dozens of strangers, treating her dignity as something negotiable, her word as inherently suspicious. She could feel eyes boring into her from every direction, some sympathetic, others curious, a few openly hostile. This was the nightmare every black person knew, the moment when simply existing in a space became an accusation, when every achievement and credential dissolved in the face of someone else's prejudice. "You're discriminating against me because of my skin color," Loretta said clearly, making sure her words carried to everyone watching. "This has nothing to do with race," Derek shot back, but his tone betrayed him, defensive and aggressive in equal measure. "I'm following protocol." Yet even as he spoke, a white family in matching sports jerseys was boarding the flight behind them, heading to business class without anyone questioning their casual attire or financial means. An elderly white man in paint-stained cargo pants shuffled past with his business class boarding pass visible, and Derek didn't spare him a glance. The double standard was so blatant it would have been laughable if it weren't so painful. Brittany arrived with her tablet, her young face creased with concern as she immediately recognized the uncomfortable position she was being put in. She had seen the entire interaction from her position at the podium, had watched Captain Hartley single out this one passenger while ignoring others, and she knew exactly what was happening. But Derek was the pilot in command, and in the hierarchy of airline operations, his authority outranked hers in matters of flight operations. "Everything looks fine, Captain Hartley," she said carefully, holding up her screen to show him. "This is a valid ticket purchased 3 weeks ago with a credit card that matches the passenger's name. All documentation is in order." Derek barely looked at the screen before shaking his head. "Run it again," he insisted, his jaw set in stubborn determination. "Check if there are any flags on this passenger." Brittany hesitated, her finger hovering over the screen, knowing that what he was asking for had no basis in actual protocol. "Sir, there's nothing to flag. The ticket is legitimate and the passenger has no history of issues." But Derek's expression had hardened into something unmovable. "Run the check again." Brittany's shoulders sagged slightly as she complied, tapping through screens she already knew would show nothing problematic. Loretta remained standing in the middle of the jetway entrance, her leather satchel clutched in both hands, feeling the weight of every stare like physical pressure against her skin. This was beyond inconvenience now. This was a public stripping away of dignity, a performance of power that said her worth could be questioned at any moment for any reason. The seconds stretched into minutes as Brittany slowly went through the motions of a pointless verification process. Other business class passengers were being directed around Loretta, some offering sympathetic glances, others looking annoyed at the delay, a few seeming to nod approvingly at Derek's vigilance. One white woman in expensive athleisure wear whispered to her companion, "Better safe than sorry," as if Loretta's presence represented some kind of threat that needed neutralizing. Loretta caught the comment and felt something crack inside her carefully maintained composure. She had spent her life being extraordinary just to be treated as barely acceptable, solving impossible problems just to sit at tables where mediocre men were welcomed without question, and still she stood here being interrogated about whether she belonged in a seat she had paid for with money she had earned. Derek turned back to Loretta with an expression that mixed false sympathy with firm resolve. "Ma'am, I need to see proof of your financial status. Credit card statement or bank letter." The request was so outrageous that Loretta actually laughed, a short sharp sound of disbelief. "You can't be serious. You're asking me to prove I can afford a ticket I already purchased?" Derek crossed his arms over his chest, the stance of someone who believed he held all the cards. "It's standard procedure for suspicious cases." Brittany's eyes went wide and she spoke up quickly, her voice tight with discomfort. "Captain, that's not actually required under any policy." Derek cut her off with a gesture. "I'm the pilot in command. I have final say on who boards my aircraft. If I determine there's a security or safety concern, I can refuse boarding to any passenger." Loretta looked past Derek at the continuing stream of passengers, watching white travelers of all ages and dress styles board without harassment, without interrogation, without being asked to prove their humanity was worth the price of a plane ticket. An older white gentleman in a rumpled T-shirt advertising a fishing charter walked past carrying a business-class boarding pass, and Derek didn't even turn his head. A young white couple in hoodies and sweatpants laughed together as they headed down the jetway, and no one questioned whether they could afford their seats. The disparity was so stark, so undeniable, that Loretta felt a surge of anger so powerful it momentarily made her dizzy. This wasn't about tickets or protocols or safety. This was about a man who looked at her skin and saw someone who didn't deserve respect, didn't deserve courtesy, didn't deserve the basic assumption of belonging that he extended automatically to people who looked like him. "I want to speak to your supervisor," Loretta said, her voice carrying steel now. Derek's expression flickered with something between annoyance and satisfaction. "You're welcome to file a complaint after you've been rebooked on a later flight. But right now, I need you to step aside so other passengers can board." The dismissal in his tone was absolute, as if her concerns were nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed. Brittany looked between them, her face pale with distress, clearly wanting to intervene but unsure how to challenge a captain's authority. Loretta felt the full weight of her exhaustion settle over her, not physical tiredness but the soul-deep weariness of fighting the same battles over and over, of having to prove and prove and prove her right to exist in spaces that should welcome everyone. Captain Hartley made his final declaration with the certainty of someone who believed he would face no consequences. "I'm sorry, but I cannot allow you to board this flight. There are too many red flags. You'll need to rebook." The words landed like stones, each one a small violence, a public announcement that she had been judged and found wanting. Loretta looked directly into Derek's eyes, seeing in them the casual cruelty of a man who thought he was doing the right thing, who would go home tonight and sleep peacefully believing he had maintained standards and protected his aircraft from some imaginary threat. "This is discrimination," Loretta said quietly but clearly. "You know it and I know it." Derek shook his head with theatrical patience. "I understand you're upset, but I have to prioritize the safety and comfort of all passengers." The implication hovered unspoken but unmistakable in the air between them, that her presence, her blackness, somehow threatened the comfort of the passengers who mattered to him. People were pulling out phones now, recording the confrontation, whispering to each other about what they were witnessing. Some seemed genuinely disturbed by what was happening, their faces registering shock at the blatant injustice. Others watched with the detached interest of spectators at entertainment, already composing the story they would tell later. A few nodded along with Derek, their expressions suggesting they approved of his vigilance, that they too believed certain people needed extra scrutiny to be allowed into premium spaces. Loretta felt all of it, every stare, every judgment, every assumption, pressing down on her like atmospheric pressure. But underneath the humiliation and anger, something else was crystallizing, a cold clear determination that this man would learn exactly who he had just dismissed. She looked at Derek one more time, memorizing his face, his name tag, the smug certainty in his expression. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your career," she said, her voice soft but carrying a promise. Derek actually smiled, a condescending curve of his mouth that said he found her threat amusing. "I doubt that, ma'am. Have a nice day." He turned away from her, already moving on to more important matters, completely unaware that the next hour of his life would unravel everything he thought he knew about power and consequences. Loretta walked away from Gate 17 with measured steps, refusing to rush, refusing to show the crowd of onlookers any sign of defeat. She moved through the terminal until she found a quiet alcove near a closed coffee shop, a space where she could collect herself away from prying eyes and recording phones. Her hands shook slightly as she set down her leather satchel and pulled out her phone, not from fear but from the adrenaline of suppressed rage. For decades, Loretta had swallowed these moments, had chosen her battles carefully, had weighed the cost of speaking up against the exhaustion of fighting. But retirement had freed her from certain calculations. She no longer had to worry about being labeled difficult or aggressive, no longer had to protect her position or reputation within NASA's political landscape. And more importantly, she had spent enough years building relationships and earning respect that when she spoke now, people in positions of power actually listened. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the name Vincent Caldwell, saved under V for reasons that now felt prophetic. Vincent was the CEO of the airline, but more importantly, he was someone she had known for 15 years. They had met when Vincent was still the director of technical operations and the airline had partnered with NASA on a project to integrate advanced navigation systems into commercial aircraft. Loretta had led the NASA side of the collaboration, and Vincent had quickly learned that her quiet demeanor masked a brilliant mind and an unwavering commitment to excellence. Over the years, even as Vincent climbed the corporate ladder and Loretta became one of the most respected engineers in aerospace, they had maintained a friendship built on mutual respect and shared values. Vincent had attended her retirement party 3 weeks ago, had given a speech about how her work had quite literally changed the trajectory of aviation safety. He had no idea that his own airline would soon test whether those words were merely polite sentiment or genuine conviction. Loretta pressed the call button on Vincent's private number, the one he had given her years ago with instructions to use it any time she needed anything. The phone rang twice before his familiar voice answered, warm and energetic even at this early hour. Loretta. What a surprise. How's retirement treating you? Are you finally getting some rest? Despite everything that had just happened, Loretta felt a flicker of warmth at his genuine pleasure in hearing from her. But that warmth was quickly subsumed by the cold anger still coursing through her system. Vincent, she said, her tone serious enough that his own voice immediately shifted in response. I need to talk to you about something that just happened on one of your flights. The next 5 minutes were among the most difficult of Loretta's professional life, not because the telling was complicated but because giving voice to the humiliation made it real in a way that standing in the moment hadn't. She recounted every detail, from Derek's initial confrontation to his demand for financial proof, from his dismissal of the gate agent's confirmation to his final refusal to let her board. She kept her voice steady and factual, but she couldn't completely hide the pain underneath the words, the accumulation of a lifetime of similar moments now crystallized in this single morning's degradation. Vincent listened without interruption, but Loretta could hear his breathing change, could sense his growing fury in the quality of his silence. When she finished, the pause that followed felt charged with electricity. Then Vincent spoke, and his voice had transformed from friendly warmth to something cold and dangerous. He did what? Give me the flight number and his name right now. Loretta provided both pieces of information, hearing Vincent repeat them to someone else in his office, his words clipped and precise. There was the sound of rapid typing, then Vincent's voice again, now directed at her but somehow also at whoever was with him. Loretta, I'm deeply sorry this happened to you. This is unacceptable. This is intolerable. This is not who we are or who we want to be as a company. Give me 10 minutes. 10 minutes and I will fix this. Before Loretta could respond, Vincent was already issuing commands to people in his office, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who expected immediate compliance. Pull Captain Derek Hartley off Flight 237 immediately. I want him in my office within the hour, and I mean in front of my desk, not in the building, in my office. Get Dar. Washington on the next available business class seat with a full written apology from me personally delivered to her before boarding. Loretta heard someone in the background protest about the logistics, about the delay this would cause, about finding a replacement pilot on short notice. Vincent's response cut through the objections like a blade. I don't care if we have to delay the flight 2 hours. I don't care if we have to charter a backup crew from another city. Get it done. And someone better personally escort Dr. Washington to her new flight with an apology so profound she feels it, or I will personally review every employee file in this airport until I find out who failed to make that happen. There was more frantic discussion in the background, then Vincent's voice returned to the phone, softer now but still carrying an edge of barely controlled anger. Loretta, you stay right where you are. I'm sending my head of customer service and my VP of operations to find you. They will take care of everything. And I promise you, I absolutely promise you, that Captain Hartley will never do this to anyone again. Comment number 1 right now if you think Derek deserved what's coming to him. Hit that like button if you believe Loretta did exactly the right thing by making that call. And subscribe because you need to see how this situation unfolds when someone finally faces real consequences for their actions. Now here's the question everyone's asking: what exactly happened when Derek found out who he'd just humiliated? Let's find out. Captain Derek Hartley settled into the pilot's seat of Flight 237 feeling satisfied with his morning's work. He ran through his pre-flight checklist with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed these tasks thousands of times, his fingers moving across switches and dials with muscle memory precision. Beside him, First Officer Ramona Chin completed her own checklist, occasionally glancing at Derek with an expression he couldn't quite read. The awkward silence between them finally broke when Ramona spoke carefully, choosing her words with obvious deliberation. That situation at the gate seemed pretty intense. Are you sure that was necessary? Derek didn't look up from his instruments as he responded, his tone suggesting the matter was already closed and required no further discussion. Had to deal with a difficult passenger. Sometimes you just know when something's off. You develop an instinct for these things after enough years in the cockpit. Ramona's hands stilled on her own controls for a moment. It seemed a bit harsh though. She had her ticket, the agent confirmed everything. What exactly was off about the situation? Now Derek did turn to look at her, his expression mixing patience with a hint of condescension. You've got to trust your instincts in this job, Ramona. Better to be cautious than to let something slip through. I've been flying a lot longer than you have, and I can tell you that maintaining standards is what keeps this industry safe and professional. Ramona opened her mouth as if to argue further, then seemed to think better of it and returned her attention to the instrument panel. Derek felt vindicated by her silence, interpreting it as agreement rather than the discomfort it actually represented. He was just reaching for his communications headset when his phone buzzed insistently in his pocket, an intrusion he normally would have ignored during pre-flight preparations. But something about the pattern of vibration made him pull it out, and when he saw the message from operations, his satisfied expression faltered. Captain Hartley, you are removed from Flight 237 effective immediately. Return to gate. Do not board aircraft. Report to headquarters. CEO direct order. Derek read the message 3 times, certain there must be some mistake, some technical glitch that had sent him a communication meant for someone else. He turned to Ramona, his voice pitched higher than normal. Did you get any unusual messages from ops? Ramona checked her own phone and shook her head, her eyes widening as she read the tension in Derek's face. Derek's fingers fumbled slightly as he called the operations desk, his mind racing through possible explanations. Equipment malfunction. Medical emergency requiring his specific skills elsewhere. Some kind of security situation. When the dispatcher answered, Derek didn't bother with pleasantries. This is Captain Hartley. I just received a message pulling me from Flight 237. What's going on? There must be some mistake. The dispatcher's voice carried an unusual stiffness, the tone of someone reading from instructions they didn't fully understand but had been told to follow exactly. No mistake, Captain. Orders from the CEO's office. You need to deplane immediately and report to headquarters at Dallas Love Field. A car is being arranged for transport. Derek felt his mouth go dry, his heart beginning to pound with a rhythm that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with dawning dread. The CEO? Why? What's this about? The dispatcher paused, and Derek could hear background noise, urgent conversations and ringing phones. We're not at liberty to discuss details, sir. You just need to comply immediately. A replacement pilot is being brought in for the flight. Derek ended the call and sat frozen in his seat, his mind spinning through the morning's events trying to identify what could possibly have triggered such an extreme response. Beside him, Ramona was staring openly now, professional courtesy giving way to undisguised shock. Derek, what's happening? What did you do? He shook his head mutely, unable to form an adequate answer because he genuinely couldn't conceive of any action that warranted this kind of intervention. He gathered his flight bag with hands that had started to tremble slightly, avoiding Ramona's eyes as he squeezed past her and exited the cockpit. The flight attendants watched him leave with expressions ranging from confusion to something that looked almost like satisfaction, as if they had witnessed what happened at the gate and were not surprised by this turn of events. As Derek walked back through the jetway, his legs felt disconnected from his body, moving automatically while his mind raced ahead to catastrophic scenarios. He emerged into the gate area to find it transformed from the scene he had left just 20 minutes earlier. Now there were 3 people in airline management uniforms clustered near the podium, speaking in urgent low tones with Brittany, who appeared close to tears. And standing slightly apart from them, speaking calmly to 2 executives Derek recognized from company newsletters, was the woman he had refused to board. Dr. Washington, the older executive was saying, his voice carrying clearly across the space, on behalf of the entire airline, we sincerely apologize for this inexcusable behavior. This is not reflective of our values or our commitment to treating every passenger with dignity and respect. Derek stopped walking, feeling as if he had been turned to stone. Dr. Washington. The words echoed in his head as his hand automatically reached for his phone, pulling it out and opening a browser with fingers that now shook noticeably. He typed Dr. Loretta Washington into the search bar and watched as results flooded his screen, each one a hammer blow to his understanding of what he had done. Dr. Loretta Washington, Ph.D., Aerospace Engineering, NASA Chief Engineer retired. Presidential Medal of Science recipient. Pioneer in spacecraft navigation systems. Led teams on 14 NASA missions. Dozens of patents. Hundreds of published papers. Images showed her standing beside presidents, shaking hands with astronauts, receiving awards from scientific societies, speaking at conferences before audiences of thousands. Derek's vision seemed to tunnel as he scrolled through result after result, each one making clear that he had not simply misjudged a passenger but had publicly humiliated one of the most accomplished aerospace engineers in American history. He had treated expertise that shaped space exploration like it was suspicious, had questioned the legitimacy of a woman whose work had quite literally altered the course of human achievement. And he had done it because he looked at her skin color and her clothing and decided she didn't fit his narrow definition of who deserved basic respect. "Oh my God," he whispered to no one in particular. "What have I done? What have I done?" Loretta must have sensed his presence because she turned slowly and looked directly at him across the gate area. Their eyes met for a long moment, and Derek searched her face desperately for some sign of what was coming, some hint that this might be recoverable. But Loretta's expression held no anger, no satisfaction, no emotion he could identify and respond to. Instead, there was only a deep weariness, a sadness that seemed to encompass not just this morning but countless other mornings like it, a disappointment that he had proven to be exactly what she had long ago learned to expect. Derek wanted to walk over to her, wanted to fall to his knees and apologize, wanted to somehow undo the last hour of his life. But his feet remained planted on the industrial carpet, and before he could force himself to move, one of the executives gently guided Loretta toward a private lounge, and she disappeared from view. 3 hours later, Derek sat in an uncomfortable chair in the executive offices at Dallas Love Field, the airline's headquarters. He had been escorted there by a driver who maintained absolute silence during the 30-minute journey, had been directed to wait in a small conference room with frosted glass walls, and had watched through those walls as people walked past, some glancing in at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. No one had spoken to him, no one had explained what was happening, and the isolation was clearly intentional, a psychological pressure designed to let him marinate in his own growing terror. When the door finally opened, Derek stood reflexively, his body responding to ingrained respect for authority even as his mind screamed with anxiety. Vincent Caldwell entered first, his expression carved from granite, followed by Patricia Monroe, the head of human resources, and Graham Foster, the airline's chief legal counsel. The three of them arranged themselves on the opposite side of the table with the choreographed precision of people who had conducted this kind of meeting before, and Derek understood with sickening clarity that he was not here for a conversation but for an execution. Vincent remained standing, his hands flat on the table surface, his gaze fixed on Derek with an intensity that made Derek want to look away but didn't dare. "Captain Hartley," Vincent began, his voice devoid of any warmth or familiarity despite the fact that he had personally presented Derek with his Pilot of the Month award just weeks earlier. "Do you understand why you're here?" Derek's throat felt thick as he tried to form words, his mind cycling through possible responses and finding each one inadequate. "Sir, I can explain. I was just following safety protocols. I had concerns about the validity of a ticket and I was trying to protect the integrity of the flight." Vincent's expression didn't change but something flickered in his eyes, a flash of something that might have been anger or might have been disgust. "Safety protocols," he repeated flatly. "You publicly humiliated one of the most respected aerospace engineers in the country based on nothing but the color of her skin and the clothes she was wearing, and you're calling that safety protocols?" Derek felt panic rising in his chest, the sensation of walls closing in from all sides. "It wasn't about race, sir. I had legitimate concerns about fraud. We've had issues with fraudulent tickets and I was simply being thorough." Graham, the legal counsel, slid a folder across the table toward Derek, his movements deliberate and clinical. "Open it," he said simply. Derek's hands shook as he complied, revealing security camera screenshots from the gate area showing him allowing white passengers in casual clothing to board without question, timestamps proving he had let them pass within minutes of stopping Loretta. Below the photos were printed statements from 6 different passengers who had witnessed the confrontation, their accounts describing Derek's tone, his demands, his refusal to accept documentation, and most damningly, the clear disparity in how he treated passengers of different races. "We also have testimony from Brittany Sullivan, the gate agent," Graham continued, "who stated under oath that you insisted on additional verification despite her confirmation that Dr. Washington's ticket was legitimate. She further stated that you have never, in her 3 years of working these gates, requested similar verification for any white passenger regardless of their appearance or documentation." Derek wanted to argue, wanted to explain that those other passengers just seemed different somehow, but even in his desperation he could hear how that would sound, could recognize that what he was about to say was the exact definition of racial profiling. Vincent leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to something even colder than before. "Your actions violated our anti-discrimination policy, damaged our reputation, and put us at risk of a major lawsuit. But more importantly, they revealed a character flaw that we cannot tolerate in someone responsible for hundreds of lives." Patricia, who had remained silent until now, opened her own folder and read from it in a voice completely devoid of emotion. "Captain Derek Hartley, your employment with this airline is terminated effective immediately for gross violation of company policy, specifically discrimination based on race. Security will escort you from the premises. You have 1 hour to clear your personal items from your locker. All company property including your uniform, identification, and access credentials must be returned before you leave the building." Derek felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath him, as if he was falling through space with nothing to grab onto. "Please," he heard himself say, the word coming out almost as a whimper. "Sir, I've been flying for 12 years. This is my whole career. This is my life. I made a mistake. I'll apologize. I'll do whatever it takes. Please don't do this." Vincent's expression didn't soften even slightly. "You didn't make a mistake," he said, each word landing with the weight of finality. "You made a choice. You looked at a woman and decided based solely on her appearance that she didn't deserve basic courtesy or respect. You chose to humiliate her publicly rather than accept documentation that would have resolved everything in seconds. You chose your prejudice over professionalism. And that choice showed us exactly who you are. We're done here." Derek felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes, a desperation so complete it bordered on physical pain. "What about my pension? My benefits? I have a family. I have a mortgage. Please, you have to understand, I was trying to do the right thing. I thought I was protecting the company. Patricia responded to this, her tone suggesting she had delivered similar news many times before and had long ago trained herself not to feel anything about it. Termination for cause means you forfeit certain benefits as outlined in your employment contract. You will receive documentation detailing what you are entitled to within 5 business days. As for your family circumstances, you should have considered those before you chose to discriminate against a passenger. This meeting is concluded. Patricia and Graham stood simultaneously and left the room without another word, but Vincent remained for one additional moment, looking at Derek with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. Dar. Loretta Washington changed the world, Vincent said quietly. She designed systems that allowed human beings to navigate through space. She opened doors for thousands of engineers who came after her. And you treated her like she was trying to steal something she hadn't earned. I've known Loretta for 15 years, and when she called me this morning, do you know what hurt her most? Not the humiliation. Not the injustice. But the fact that in 2025, she's still having to prove she belongs. You did that. You. And you'll have to live with that for the rest of your life. Then Vincent was gone too, and Derek was alone in the conference room with the weight of his shattered career pressing down on him like atmosphere. Within hours, the story had spread across social media. Passengers who had recorded the confrontation posted their videos online with captions expressing outrage and support for Loretta. The hashtags Justice for Dr. Washington and Racism in the Skies began trending, accumulating hundreds of thousands of posts. The airline released a public statement before the evening news cycle, a carefully worded announcement that managed to express zero tolerance for discrimination while also protecting the company from liability. We are aware of an incident this morning involving one of our pilots and a valued passenger. The behavior displayed does not reflect our values or our commitment to inclusive travel. The employee in question has been terminated, and we have reached out personally to the affected passenger to express our deepest apologies. Derek's name was not mentioned in the official statement, but the internet had no such restraint. Within 12 hours, his full name, his photo from the company website, even his home address had been shared across multiple platforms. The comments ranged from calls for accountability to outright threats against his safety. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages from friends and family, from journalists requesting interviews, from strangers telling him he deserved to lose everything. Derek turned off his phone and sat in his car in the headquarters parking lot as the sun set over Dallas, unable to make himself drive home to face his wife and children, unable to process the magnitude of what he had lost in a single morning because he had seen a black woman and decided she didn't belong. Loretta boarded the 7 p.m. flight to San Francisco in Seat 2A, upgraded at the airline's insistence to first class despite her protests that business class had been perfectly adequate for her needs. The gate agent who had escorted her to the aircraft had handed her a handwritten note from Vincent Caldwell that read simply, "Loretta, I'm so sorry. You deserve better than what happened today. You've always deserved better. Thank you for giving us the chance to make this right." The note was signed with his full name, a personal touch that made it clear this wasn't corporate boilerplate but genuine remorse from someone who understood the weight of what had occurred. As Loretta settled into her seat, she noticed the pilot emerging from the cockpit to greet passengers, a practice not all captains engaged in but one that some found helped humanize the experience. The pilot was a black woman in her early 40s, her uniform immaculate, her smile warm and professional as she shook hands and exchanged pleasantries with first-class passengers. When she reached Loretta's row, her expression shifted to something between awe and excitement. "Dr. Washington." Captain Tanya Bridgewater extended her hand with obvious reverence. "It's an incredible honor to have you on my flight. I studied your work on autonomous navigation systems when I was getting my engineering degree before I went into commercial aviation. Your research literally shaped how I understand flight mechanics." Loretta felt a warmth spreading through her chest, the kind that came from being recognized not for what had happened today but for what she had built over decades. "Thank you, Captain Bridgewater. And congratulations on your command. Keep flying high. Keep opening doors. The younger woman's eyes glistened slightly as she nodded, understanding passing between them that transcended words, a recognition of what it meant to be a black woman in spaces that still acted surprised by their presence. During the flight, Loretta declined the champagne and elaborate meal service, asking instead for hot tea and the simple comfort of silence. She gazed out the window at clouds rendered golden by the setting sun, processing the day's events with the analytical mind that had served her throughout her career. She felt no satisfaction in Derek Hartley's termination, no sense of triumph or revenge. Instead, she felt the familiar exhaustion of being made into a symbol, of having a single morning's indignity become a teaching moment for a society that seemed to require endless teaching about the same fundamental lesson. She thought about all the times she had stayed silent, all the smaller humiliations she had absorbed because fighting every battle was impossible and she needed to save her energy for the work that mattered. But she also recognized that her silence, however understandable, had allowed men like Derek Hartley to continue operating under the assumption that their prejudices carried no consequences. The plane touched down at San Francisco International Airport precisely on schedule, and Loretta gathered her worn leather satchel, preparing to finally focus on the reason she had made this trip in the first place. A car service was waiting to transport her to the St. Regis Hotel, where the International Society of Aerospace Engineers had arranged accommodation for award recipients. The next morning, she woke early from habit, dressed in the elegant navy suit she had brought for the occasion, and arrived at the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel to find it transformed into a celebration of excellence that brought together over 500 engineers, pilots, executives, and academics from around the world. The program listed presentations from industry leaders, panels on emerging technologies, and culminating in the evening with the Lifetime Achievement Award ceremony. Throughout the day, Loretta found herself surrounded by colleagues and admirers, many of whom had seen the news coverage and wanted to express their support. But what touched her most were the younger engineers, particularly the women and people of color, who approached her with stories of how her work had inspired their own careers. A 27-year-old Indian-American woman named Priya told Loretta about growing up seeing her photo in a textbook chapter about navigation systems and realizing for the first time that someone who looked different from the typical white male engineer could reach the highest levels of aerospace achievement. A 32-year-old black man named Marcus described how he had written his doctoral dissertation building on Loretta's research and now worked for SpaceX designing systems for Mars missions. Each conversation reminded Loretta why the morning's humiliation, as painful as it had been, mattered less than the legacy she had built through decades of excellence. When evening arrived and the ballroom lights dimmed for the award ceremony, Loretta sat at a table with Vincent Caldwell, who had flown in specifically for the event, along with several former NASA colleagues and current industry leaders. The Society's president, Howard Finch, took the stage and began the introduction for the Lifetime Achievement Award with a comprehensive review of Loretta's career that made even her uncomfortable with its lavish praise. Dr. Loretta Washington's contributions to aerospace engineering cannot be overstated, Howard said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast room. She has designed navigation systems for 14 NASA missions, holds 43 patents, has published over 200 peer-reviewed papers, and has mentored more than 200 engineers who have gone on to shape the industry. But beyond her technical brilliance, Dr. Washington has broken barriers, opened doors, and proved through her example that excellence transcends any attempt to limit it based on gender or race. Loretta walked to the stage amid thunderous applause, accepting the crystal trophy that seemed to capture and refract all the light in the room, transforming it into something that looked almost alive. She stood at the podium for a long moment, looking out at the sea of faces, seeing in them the future of an industry she had devoted her life to improving. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear, carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard. This morning, she began, and the room went absolutely silent. I was reminded that no matter how many degrees you earn, how many missions you complete, how many awards you receive, there will still be people who judge you by the color of your skin before they consider the content of your character or the quality of your work. A pilot refused to let me board an airplane because he looked at me and saw only someone who didn't belong, someone whose presence needed to be questioned and verified and ultimately rejected. She paused, letting the words sink in, watching as people in the audience nodded with recognition, their own experiences clearly reflected in her story. But here's what that pilot and people like him don't understand. Our worth is not defined by their limited vision. It's not diminished by their prejudice. It's not determined by whether they grant us permission to occupy spaces we have every right to be in. Our worth is defined by what we build, what we create, what we solve, and how we lift others up behind us. I have spent 28 years at NASA not because someone decided to give me a chance, but because I earned my place through work that could not be denied. And every young engineer who sits in this room tonight, regardless of what you look like or where you came from, you belong here too. Not because of anyone's charity or generosity, but because you have the capability and the commitment to push this field forward. The applause that followed was different from the polite recognition that had greeted previous speakers. This was standing ovation that seemed to physically move through the room like a wave, people rising from their seats with expressions that ranged from tears to fierce pride. Loretta stood at the podium holding her award and thought about the long arc of progress, about how far the industry had come and how far it still needed to go, about Derek Hartley sitting somewhere in Dallas contemplating the ruins of his career and perhaps, just perhaps, beginning to understand what his prejudice had cost not just him but everyone it touched. 2 months after the incident at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, Derek Hartley sat in his home office, which was really just the corner of his bedroom in the small apartment he and his family had moved into after selling their house. The walls were bare, still waiting for pictures he hadn't had the energy to hang, and the desk was cheap particle board from a discount furniture store, a stark contrast to the solid oak piece that had occupied his previous home office. Derek stared at his laptop screen, reading the same job rejection email for the 3rd time, as if repetition might somehow change the words. He had applied to 26 different airlines, from major carriers to regional operations, from cargo companies to charter services. Every application had been rejected, most with form letter responses, a few with more specific feedback that basically said the same thing in different words: we cannot hire someone with your history. 3 smaller operations had invited him for interviews, and for brief moments Derek had allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he could salvage something from the wreckage. But each interview had ended the same way, with pointed questions about the incident, with requests for his perspective, and with his increasingly desperate attempts to frame what happened as a misunderstanding or an overreaction falling flat against the evidence of video footage and witness statements. The most recent interview, just 2 days ago, had been with a regional airline called Summit Express that operated small commuter flights throughout the Mountain West. The chief pilot, a weathered man named Calvin Peters who looked like he'd been flying since the dawn of aviation, had reviewed Derek's application with initial approval, noting his flight hours and experience with various aircraft. But then Calvin had leaned back in his chair and asked the question Derek had learned to dread. "So let's talk about Dallas. Tell me what happened from your perspective." Derek had launched into his carefully rehearsed explanation, trying to frame his actions as concern about security rather than discrimination, emphasizing his intentions rather than the impact, explaining that the media had blown everything out of proportion and created a narrative that didn't reflect reality. Calvin had listened without interruption, his expression never changing, until Derek ran out of words and sat waiting for some sign of understanding or sympathy. Then Calvin had pulled out his phone, opened the video, and turned it around so Derek could see his own face on the screen, his own voice saying "How did you afford a business class ticket?" his own gestures waving away documentation while white passengers streamed past behind him. Calvin had let the video play for 30 seconds before pausing it and setting the phone down between them. "Mr. Hartley," Calvin had said quietly, "I've been flying for 38 years. I've made mistakes. Every pilot has. But what I watched in that video wasn't a mistake. That was a choice. That was you deciding that a woman's skin color was more important than her ticket, her ID, and the confirmation from your own gate agent. And I can't put someone in my cockpits who makes those kinds of choices because sooner or later, that judgment problem is going to affect flight safety or crew dynamics. I'm sorry, but we can't hire you. The rejections were compounding Derek's financial problems into a crisis that kept him awake at night and consumed every waking hour. His wife Melissa worked as a teacher, a job she loved but that paid modestly even in good times, and her salary couldn't cover the expenses they had accumulated during Derek's well-paid career as a commercial pilot. They had sold the house, as Derek had known they would have to do, taking a loss because they couldn't afford to wait for the right offer. They had sold one of their cars, keeping only the older sedan that Melissa drove to work while Derek stayed home and sent out applications that went nowhere. They had withdrawn their 2 children, 8-year-old Connor and 6-year-old Sophie, from the private school they had attended since kindergarten, enrolling them instead in the overcrowded public school 2 miles from their new apartment. But the financial strain, as devastating as it was, paled in comparison to the damage Derek had done to his marriage and his relationship with his children. Melissa had initially supported him when the news first broke, believing his version of events, trusting that her husband would never intentionally discriminate against someone. But as the evidence accumulated, as she watched the videos and read the witness statements and saw the undeniable disparity in how Derek had treated passengers, her support had curdled into something between disappointment and disgust. One night, about a month after Derek's termination, Melissa had confronted him in their bedroom while the children slept, her voice shaking with an emotion Derek eventually recognized as grief. "I watched that video, Derek. I watched all of them. You were cruel. That woman did nothing wrong, had done everything right, and you treated her like she was trying to commit fraud just by existing. How could you do that? How could the man I married be capable of that?" Derek had tried to explain, had tried to make her understand that he hadn't intended to be cruel, that he'd been trying to maintain standards and ensure security. But even as the words left his mouth, he could hear how hollow they sounded, how they failed to account for the central question his wife was asking: why had those concerns applied only to one passenger who happened to be black? Melissa had listened to his explanations with an expression that grew increasingly distant, and when he finally fell silent she had said something that cut deeper than any job rejection: "I don't think I know you. I thought I did, but the person in that video is a stranger to me. And I don't know if I can be married to someone who would treat another human being that way." She hadn't left, hadn't filed for divorce, but something essential between them had fractured, and Derek didn't know if it could ever be repaired. His children had been affected too, in ways that broke Derek's heart every time he thought about them. Connor had come home from school 2 weeks after the incident with tears streaming down his face, having been confronted by classmates who had seen the video or heard their parents discussing it. "Dad," the 8-year-old had asked with the devastating directness of children, "kids at school say you got fired for being mean to a black lady. They say you're racist. Is that true?" Derek had frozen, unable to formulate an answer that was both honest and something his son could process. He'd eventually managed some version of "I made a mistake and I'm sorry for it," but Connor had looked at him with confusion and disappointment, sensing the inadequacy of the response even if he couldn't articulate why. Sophie, at 6, didn't fully understand what had happened, but she felt the tension in the household, the way her parents spoke to each other with careful formality, the way her father spent all day in his room instead of going to work like he used to, the way they had moved to a smaller place with no backyard and her mother cried sometimes when she thought no one was watching. Children were sensitive to disruption even when they couldn't name its source, and Sophie had become clingy and anxious, asking repeatedly if everything was okay, if they were still a family, if Daddy was going to leave. Each question felt like a small knife twisting in Derek's chest, reminding him that his actions that morning hadn't just destroyed his own life but had sent shock waves through the people he loved most. Derek spent his days now in a routine that felt like punishment, waking up without purpose, sending out applications he knew would be rejected, scrolling through social media posts about the incident that ranged from people defending his right to be cautious to people calling for him to face criminal charges. He had tried to explain his side of the story in a few online posts early on, but those attempts had been met with such overwhelming criticism and detailed dismantling of his arguments that he'd given up. The internet, he learned, never forgot and never forgave, and his name would apparently be permanently linked to phrases like racist pilot and discrimination in the skies. In his darkest moments, usually late at night when Melissa was asleep and the apartment was silent, Derek allowed himself to really examine what he had done and why he had done it. He thought about his childhood in a wealthy white suburb where the only black people he'd seen regularly were the cleaning staff at his school and the landscaping crews in his neighborhood. He thought about jokes he'd laughed at in college, casual comments about certain people not belonging in certain places that he'd accepted as normal social observation rather than prejudice. He thought about how he'd formed mental categories over the years, assumptions about who fit where, who belonged in premium spaces and who should be questioned, and he slowly, painfully recognized that those assumptions had been built on a foundation of racism he'd never acknowledged or challenged. The recognition didn't make him feel better. It made him feel worse, because he couldn't claim ignorance anymore, couldn't pretend he'd made an innocent mistake. He had to face the fact that he had harmed someone because of beliefs he'd held without ever examining them, and that realization was almost unbearable. Derek had started attending workshops on diversity and inclusion, sessions offered by community organizations for people who wanted to educate themselves about racial bias. He sat in circles with other people who were grappling with their own prejudices, listening to facilitators explain concepts like implicit bias and systemic racism, completing exercises designed to help participants recognize their own blind spots. The work was uncomfortable and often painful, forcing Derek to confront aspects of himself he preferred not to see. But he kept showing up to the sessions, kept doing the reading, kept trying to understand how he had become someone capable of treating another person the way he treated Loretta Washington. He knew that understanding didn't erase what he'd done, didn't repair the harm, didn't entitle him to forgiveness. But it was the only path forward he could see, the only way to ensure he never made the same choice again. 1 year after the incident, Loretta Washington stood on a stage at MIT's Kresge Auditorium, addressing an audience of over 1,000 students, faculty, and guests who had come to hear her speak as part of the university's Distinguished Speakers series. The auditorium's dramatic architecture, with its thin shell concrete roof and glass walls, created a sense of openness that matched the spirit of Loretta's message. She had spent the past 12 months traveling extensively, giving lectures at universities and conferences, sharing her story not as a tale of victimization but as a catalyst for change. The incident at Dallas-Fort Worth had given her a platform she'd never sought but now felt obligated to use, transforming a moment of humiliation into an opportunity to address systemic problems that extended far beyond one pilot's prejudice. The scholarship fund she had established, Wings of Dignity, had grown beyond her initial modest vision into a substantial operation funded by donations from aerospace companies, private individuals, and organizations committed to diversifying the industry. The fund provided full scholarships to women and people of color pursuing degrees in aerospace engineering, aviation, and related fields, but it also offered mentorship, internship placements, and networking opportunities designed to address the barriers that extended beyond just tuition costs. In its first year, Wings of Dignity had awarded scholarships to 48 students, and every one of them had sent Loretta personal notes describing how the support had changed not just their educational trajectory but their sense of what was possible for them in the industry. Vincent Caldwell had proven to be more than just a friend offering sympathy. He had implemented mandatory anti-discrimination training for every single employee of the airline, from baggage handlers to board members, with a particular focus on identifying and counteracting implicit bias. The training wasn't a single session but an ongoing program with quarterly refreshers and accountability measures that included performance evaluations tied to demonstrated understanding and application of inclusive practices. Vincent had also established an anonymous reporting system for passengers who experienced discrimination, with each report triggering an immediate investigation and requiring executive-level review. The airline's commitment to these changes had been noticed by industry publications and civil rights organizations, several of which had recognized the company for its leadership in addressing systemic bias in air travel. As Loretta stood at the MIT podium, looking out at faces representing dozens of countries and cultures, she saw reflected in them the future she had worked her entire career to help create. Young women of every background who could envision themselves as engineers because someone who looked like them had achieved excellence in the field. Young men of color who didn't have to choose between their identity and their ambitions because pathways had been cleared by those who came before. The diversity in the audience was itself a testament to progress, even if that progress remained incomplete and required constant vigilance to maintain. When Loretta spoke, her voice carried the authority of lived experience combined with technical mastery, the unique credibility of someone who had both endured discrimination and achieved undeniable excellence despite it. After her presentation, as Loretta stood in the lobby greeting audience members and signing copies of a newly published memoir she'd been persuaded to write, a figure approached that made her pause. Derek Hartley looked dramatically different from the confident pilot who had blocked her path a year earlier. He had lost weight, his face showing the angular planes of stress and sleepless nights, and his clothes, while neat, lacked the crisp professionalism of his old uniform. He waited patiently at the edge of the crowd, not pushing forward, clearly uncertain about whether he should approach at all. When the group around Loretta finally thinned and he stepped forward, his hands were shaking visibly. "Dr. Washington," Derek began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know I have no right to speak to you. I know an apology can't undo what I did. But I need you to know that I'm deeply, profoundly sorry for how I treated you. I've spent this past year trying to understand how I became someone capable of doing what I did. I've been learning about systemic racism, implicit bias, the history of discrimination that I was blind to or chose not to see. I know that understanding doesn't excuse anything, doesn't repair the harm. But I needed you to know that I recognize fully what I did and how wrong it was, not just wrong because it cost me my career but wrong because I treated you as less than human based solely on the color of your skin." Loretta studied Derek for a long moment, seeing in his face genuine remorse rather than the self-pity she might have expected. She thought about all the times people had harmed her through prejudice and never acknowledged it, never admitted fault, never did the difficult work of examining their own assumptions. She thought about the cost of carrying anger and resentment, about whether holding on to hurt served any purpose beyond giving her a sense of justified grievance. And she thought about the students she had just spoken to, the message she had tried to convey about responding to injustice with both strength and grace, about demanding accountability while also allowing for the possibility of growth. "Mr. Hartley," Loretta said finally, her voice measured and clear, "I appreciate your apology. But you need to understand something. I don't need your apology for closure. I didn't need you to grovel or beg for forgiveness. What I needed was justice, and I got it. What I needed was for someone to face consequences so that maybe, just maybe, the next time someone in your position looks at a person of color and feels that impulse to question their right to be somewhere, they'll remember what happened to you and choose differently. Your apology is something you need, not something I require. What matters now is what you do with your understanding. Do you use it to become better? Do you teach others? Do you speak up when you see injustice instead of participating in it? That's where redemption lives, not in apologies but in changed behavior and actions that help others." Derek nodded, tears streaming down his face openly now, making no attempt to hide them or wipe them away. "I'm trying," he said. "I've been volunteering with organizations that do anti-racism education. I've been sharing my story in workshops, being honest about my mistakes even though it's humiliating. I know I can't be a pilot again. That door is closed and I accept that. But I'm trying to use what happened to help other people understand before they make the same mistakes I did. I know it doesn't balance the scales. I know it doesn't repair what I broke. But it's all I can offer." Loretta extended her hand, and after a moment of surprise, Derek shook it. "Then I hope you continue that work," Loretta said. "Not for me, but for everyone who will encounter people in positions of power who have to choose between their prejudices and their principles. You have a responsibility now to make sure your mistakes become lessons that prevent others from causing the same harm. That's heavy, carrying that weight. But it's also the only path forward that matters." Derek thanked her, his voice breaking, and then stepped back into the crowd and disappeared, leaving Loretta with the complicated feeling of having extended grace without absolution, having acknowledged remorse without erasing consequences. Later that evening, Loretta sat in her hotel room overlooking the Charles River, reflecting on the strange journey of the past year. Her life had changed in ways both exhausting and rewarding, transforming her from a private person content with her technical achievements into a public figure carrying the weight of representing something larger than herself. She thought about the morning at Dallas-Fort Worth, about the moment when Derek Hartley had refused to let her board, about how she had stood there deciding whether to accept the humiliation or fight back. She knew that if she had stayed silent, if she had simply walked away and booked another flight and never reported what happened, Derek would still be flying, would still be making those same assumptions about people, would eventually have treated someone else the same way. Her choice to make that phone call, to demand accountability, had rippled outward in ways she couldn't have predicted, creating change that extended far beyond one pilot losing his job. The next morning, Loretta visited one of the Wings of Dignity scholarship recipients at MIT, a brilliant young black woman named Jasmine Moore who was studying aerospace engineering with a focus on sustainable aviation technology. Jasmine gave Loretta a tour of the lab where she was working on her undergraduate research project, explaining complex propulsion systems with the fluent enthusiasm of someone completely in love with her field. As they walked through the engineering building, passing walls covered with photos of famous alumni and breakthrough discoveries, Loretta was struck by how few of those photos included faces that looked like hers or Jasmine's. The field had changed, was still changing, but the visual history suggested how recent and fragile that progress remained. Over coffee in the student union, Jasmine asked the question that young people always ask Loretta, the question that never got easier to answer even as she refined her response. Dr. Washington, what do I do when people don't believe in me? When they look at me and see someone who doesn't belong, someone who must be here because of affirmative action or lowered standards rather than merit? How do you keep going when you're constantly having to prove yourself in ways that white men never have to? Loretta set down her cup and looked directly into Jasmine's eyes, seeing in them the same determination and vulnerability she remembered feeling at that age, the same hunger for a path forward that honored both her identity and her ambition. Then you make them believe, Loretta said simply. Not with anger, though you'll feel plenty of that. Not with bitterness, though it will be tempting to let that consume you. You make them believe through excellence so undeniable they can't ignore it, through integrity so consistent they can't question it, and by building a body of work that speaks louder than their doubts. But here's what's equally important, and hear me clearly on this, you never let someone else's limited vision become your ceiling. Their inability to see your value doesn't diminish your worth. Their prejudice doesn't define your potential. And you have something they'll never have, you know what it's like to overcome obstacles they can't even perceive, and that makes you stronger, more resilient, more capable of innovation because you've had to find creative solutions your whole life just to get the opportunities they take for granted. Jasmine absorbed these words with visible emotion, her eyes bright with tears she was trying to hold back. After a moment, she reached across the table and took Loretta's hand. Thank you, she said softly. Thank you for fighting that day. Thank you for not staying silent. Thank you for everything you've done to make it possible for people like me to be here. Loretta squeezed the young woman's hand, feeling the weight of responsibility and the lightness of hope intertwining in that gesture, understanding that this moment of connection and transmission of strength from one generation to the next, this was why the humiliation had been worth enduring, why the fight had been necessary, why she would do it all again if required. As Loretta walked across MIT's campus that afternoon, preparing to return home to California, she thought about Derek Hartley and wondered if he would truly change, if the lessons he claimed to have learned would translate into lasting transformation or fade over time into resentment and defensiveness. She thought about the thousands of other Derek Hartleys in positions of power, making similar assumptions, causing similar harm, creating barriers for people who deserved better. And she thought about the Jasmines of the world, brilliant young people who would face those barriers and either be stopped by them or break through them depending partly on their own strength but also on whether people like Loretta chose to fight when fighting was required. The story that had begun with one pilot's prejudice and one phone call to a CEO had become something larger, something that transcended the individuals involved and spoke to systemic patterns that required systemic solutions. Loretta had become a symbol of grace under pressure, of dignified resistance, of the power of speaking truth to power. But she also remained simply herself, a woman who had devoted her life to solving complex problems and who now found herself solving a different kind of problem, the problem of how to create lasting change in a society that too often preferred comfortable injustice to the disruption of accountability. As she boarded her flight home, she smiled at the pilot, a young Latino man whose name tag read Captain Rodriguez, and he smiled back with genuine warmth and respect, treating her exactly as every passenger deserved to be treated, as a human being worthy of courtesy and dignity regardless of what she was wearing or what her skin looked like. What do you think about Loretta's journey and the changes that came from one moment of courage? Drop a comment below with your thoughts on how we can continue pushing for equality in all spaces. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss stories of people who stand up for justice and dignity. Thank you for watching, and remember that your voice matters, your actions count, and silence never changed anything. Keep fighting for what's right, keep supporting those who need allies, and keep believing that progress is possible when enough people demand it. Until next time, take care of each other and never let anyone convince you that you don't belong in spaces you've earned the right to occupy. This powerful story teaches us that prejudice carries consequences that extend far beyond a single moment. Captain Derek Hartley's assumptions about who belonged in business class weren't just personal opinions but manifestations of systemic racism that Black Americans face daily, even those with extraordinary achievements like Dr. Loretta Washington. The incident reminds us that credentials, accomplishments, and dignity mean nothing to those who judge solely by appearance and skin color. The most crucial lesson is that silence enables injustice to continue. Loretta's decision to make that phone call wasn't about revenge but accountability. Her action protected future passengers from similar treatment and sparked meaningful institutional change. It demonstrated that speaking up, even when exhausting and painful, creates ripples that benefit entire communities. We also learn that true allyship requires action, not just words. Vincent Caldwell didn't simply apologize. He implemented systemic reforms and used his power to ensure the airline's values matched its stated commitments. Derek's story shows that ignorance isn't an excuse. His assumptions were built on unchallenged prejudices that he never examined until facing consequences. Finally, this story illustrates that excellence and integrity are the most powerful responses to discrimination. Loretta didn't need Derek's validation to know her worth. She built a legacy through undeniable achievements while maintaining grace under pressure, proving that dignity cannot be stripped away by someone else's narrow vision. Has someone ever judged you based on appearance rather than character? Share your experience in the comments below. If you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of how they look, hit that like button right now. What would you have done in Loretta's position? Would you have stayed silent or spoken up? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss stories about courage, justice, and people who refuse to accept discrimination. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters and their experiences are valid. Thank you for watching and for being part of a community that values equality and human dignity. Remember that change happens when ordinary people choose extraordinary courage. Your actions matter, your voice counts, and together we can create a world where everyone belongs. Keep standing up for what's right, keep supporting those who face injustice, and never let anyone convince you that prejudice is acceptable. Until next time, treat others with the respect they deserve and demand the same for yourself.